Somewhere right now, someone is lying awake, replaying a conversation from years ago, trying uselessly to control something that already happened and cannot be touched again. Somewhere else, someone is calmly doing the one thing actually available to them in a difficult situation, their own next honest action, completely at peace with everything surrounding it that they cannot direct. There is a line between these two people, and almost nobody is ever taught exactly where it sits. Modern life is full of quiet promises that control is more available than it actually is. Plan enough, work hard enough, optimize enough, and outcomes will fall reliably into line. This promise is comforting, and it is also, in its strongest form, false. Picture someone who has done everything within their power to prepare for something important, studied thoroughly, practiced diligently, arrived rested and ready, and the outcome still doesn't go their way, for reasons entirely outside anything they controlled. This isn't a failure of effort. It's an accurate demonstration of a boundary that effort alone was never going to cross. Understanding exactly where that boundary sits, rather than assuming it extends further than it does, changes almost everything about how a person handles both success and disappointment. The genuinely useful distinction, stripped of complication, is this: within your control sits your own effort, your own honesty, your own attitude, and your own response to whatever happens. Outside your control sits outcomes, other people's choices, the past, and most external circumstances, regardless of how much they affect you. Picture drawing this line explicitly for a specific situation: a job application, a difficult relationship, a health concern. On one side, the quality of the application you submit, how honestly you show up in the relationship, whether you follow medical guidance available to you. On the other side, whether you get the job, whether the other person changes, how your body actually responds. Nearly all unnecessary suffering discussed throughout this episode traces back to confusing which side of this line a given thing actually sits on. Once this line is clear, a specific pattern becomes visible everywhere. An enormous amount of daily distress comes not from difficult circumstances themselves, but from the exhausting, doomed effort to control something that was never actually controllable in the first place. Picture someone spending hours mentally rehearsing ways to make another adult person change a deeply held opinion, growing more frustrated with each attempt, as though sufficient effort or the right words could eventually override someone else's independent mind. This effort isn't just unsuccessful. It's fighting against a boundary that was never actually movable, and the frustration it produces is largely self-inflicted, born from refusing to acknowledge where the boundary actually sits. One of the more freeing distinctions available is separating the effort a person puts into something from the outcome that effort produces. Two things people tend to treat as more tightly linked than they actually are. Picture an athlete who trains with total dedication for a competition, performs exactly as well as their preparation allowed, and still loses to someone with a stronger natural gift or a lucky break on the day. If self-worth is tied to the outcome, this feels like failure. If self-worth is tied to the effort, the part actually within control, this same result can be met with genuine satisfaction, because the only thing that was ever truly theirs to deliver was delivered fully. For a lot of people, the drive to control things beyond their actual reach isn't really about the specific thing being controlled. It's a way of managing an underlying discomfort with uncertainty itself. Picture someone who compulsively checks and rechecks a situation they have no real influence over, refreshing news, replaying a decision already made, seeking reassurance from others about something nobody can actually predict. This behavior rarely changes the outcome. What it does is temporarily reduce the anxious discomfort of sitting inside genuine uncertainty, even though the relief is brief and the underlying uncertainty remains completely unchanged by any of it. Recognizing this pattern for what it is, anxiety management disguised as productive control, is often the first step toward addressing the actual discomfort directly, rather than performing an endless, ultimately ineffective ritual around it. Among the most common and most costly boundary violations discussed in this episode is the attempt to control other people's choices, feelings, or behavior, something that, no matter how close the relationship, was never actually within anyone else's power to begin with. Picture a parent attempting to control an adult child's career choice, a partner attempting to control the other's friendships, a friend attempting to manage another friend's emotional reactions through careful, constant management of what gets said around them. Each of these efforts, however well-intentioned, tends to produce resentment, distance, or covert resistance rather than the compliance being sought, because people, on some level, reliably resist attempts to be controlled, even by people who genuinely love them. Influence, offered honestly and respectfully, remains genuinely available. Control over another person's independence never actually was. A common fear keeps people gripping tightly to things outside their control. The belief that releasing that grip means abandoning care, giving up, or ceasing to try altogether. Picture the difference between someone who has done everything genuinely within their power for a struggling loved one and continues to release the outcome itself, versus someone who either exhausts themselves trying to control an outcome that was never theirs, or abandons the relationship entirely out of frustrated helplessness. There is a third option, harder to hold than either extreme: continuing full effort on the controllable part, while genuinely releasing attachment to the uncontrollable part. This isn't giving up. It's aiming effort at the only place it was ever going to actually land. There's a specific, durable peace available once a person genuinely internalizes where their actual control ends, not resignation, but an accurate accounting of where effort is well spent and where it's being poured into something that was never going to receive it. Picture someone who has spent years fighting circumstances entirely outside their control. A diagnosis, another person's choices, a past that cannot be changed, finally shifting all of that same energy toward what remains genuinely available to them in the present. This shift rarely happens instantly, and it doesn't eliminate the difficulty of the circumstance itself. But it removes a second, entirely optional layer of suffering that was never actually required by the circumstance, only by the refusal to accept its actual boundaries. If nearly everything external sits outside genuine control, what remains? One thing consistently, in every circumstance without exception: how a person chooses to respond to whatever is actually happening. Picture two people facing the identical difficult circumstance, a serious setback neither of them chose or could have prevented. One spends their energy raging against the unfairness of it, unable to move past the fact that it happened at all. The other, while acknowledging the same unfairness honestly, directs their available energy toward the next available response. What can actually be done now, given where things stand? The circumstance was identical for both. The one variable that remained genuinely within each person's control, their response to it, produced two entirely different experiences of the same event. Perfectionism, examined closely, is often less about high standards and more about an attempt to control outcomes so completely that failure or criticism becomes impossible. An attempt, ultimately, to control something that was never fully controllable in the first place. Picture someone who delays finishing or sharing work indefinitely, convinced that with enough additional refinement, the outcome, including how it's received by others, can be made fully predictable and safe from criticism. This is control seeking applied to a domain that includes other people's independent reactions, which were never actually available to be controlled, regardless of how much additional effort gets poured into the attempt. In work and leadership specifically, this same pattern shows up as micromanagement, an attempt to control the specific method of every task, rather than trusting genuinely capable people with the outcome and the general approach. Picture a manager who reviews every minor decision a competent team member makes, unable to tolerate any approach different from their own, even when the team member's actual results are consistently good. This behavior is rarely framed internally as an attempt to control the uncontrollable. It's framed as diligence or high standards. Examined honestly, it's often exactly the same underlying pattern discussed throughout this episode. A discomfort with genuine uncertainty, expressed as an attempt to control something. In this case, another competent adult's process that was never actually the manager's to control in the first place. A specific practical shift available to almost anyone, building daily commitment around a controllable process rather than around an outcome that ultimately isn't fully within reach. Picture someone whose goal is framed entirely around a specific external outcome, a particular result, a particular response from someone else, a particular number reached by a particular date. Compare this to someone whose commitment is framed around a controllable process, showing up consistently, doing honest work, applying real effort daily, with the outcome understood as a probable, but never fully guaranteed, result of that process. The second framing tends to produce far more consistent daily behavior because it doesn't depend on the cooperation of variables genuinely outside anyone's control to feel worth continuing. This same underlying pattern appears, in a more painful form, during genuine loss, a specific desire to control something inherently uncontrollable, the timeline, shape, and intensity of grief itself. Picture someone attempting to control their own grieving process, the way they might control a work project, setting an internal deadline for when they should feel better, becoming frustrated with themselves when grief doesn't comply with that schedule. Grief, discussed at length in an earlier episode of this series, simply doesn't operate on a controllable timeline. Attempting to manage it, as though it did, tends to add an additional, entirely unnecessary layer of suffering on top of an already difficult process. The same pattern, in a more painful setting, as everything else explored throughout this episode. Ultimately, the practical value of everything discussed in this episode comes down to a single, ongoing habit, regularly and honestly sorting what's actually in front of a person into what's within their control and what isn't, and directing real effort only toward the first category. Picture this as a habit practiced daily, in small situations as much as large ones. A frustrating commute, a difficult colleague, a serious health concern, a disappointing outcome after real effort. In each case, briefly and honestly asking, what part of this is actually mine to influence, and what part isn't? This single habit, repeated enough times, gradually redirects a person's limited daily energy away from friction that was never going to yield, and toward the much smaller, much more productive space where real change is actually possible. Like everything else explored throughout this series, learning this line is never accomplished in a single decisive moment. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, and every other quality discussed in this series are built through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The energy redirected from an uncontrollable outcome toward the effort that actually produced it. The grip loosened on another person's choices, replaced with honest influence instead. The grief allowed its own uncontrollable timeline, rather than forced onto a schedule that was never available. The daily habit of sorting, briefly and honestly, what's actually within reach from what only felt like it should be. None of it resolves the difficulty of hard circumstances themselves, but it removes the second optional layer of suffering that comes specifically from standing on the wrong side of a line most people never learned existed, and it accumulates, quietly, into a life spent fighting far fewer battles that were never actually winnable in the first place. That is the line you keep crossing without noticing, not because you lack discipline, but because nobody ever showed you exactly where it sits. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs the reminder.